The importance of food is pretty clear. It's important in terms of health. It's important in terms of our social well-being. Breaking bread together is quite an important thing to do. And it's important economically in terms of fish and farming and the industries represented here. My beginnings at the beginning of the Second World War had three major impacts on me. First of all, food rationing. And I've still got my ration book. I've suggested to a number of Secretaries of State over the years that we should return to that, but it never seems to have caught on. The second thing that we did have, and I'm not sure if anybody here will remember, we had pig bins. These were bins filled with rubbish food which sat outside and were then taken away to feed the animals with. They were very good as goalposts. With the lights and the pig bin, we could play football without any bother. And it's quite interesting thinking about food waste now and what we do with it, because it's very significant, as I'm sure you will discuss later. And the third thing was every night I had a spoonful of cod liver oil. And that was because there was no sun in Glasgow. It was dark at night, and during the day it was entirely smogged and fog, and it was terrible. And the incidence of rickets, for example, in places like Glasgow was very significant. One of our obstetricians, for example, had a special interest in rickets in women in childbirth because of the distortion of the pelvis. So every night I got my spoonful of cod liver oil just to keep me going, and I don't think I've got rickets yet. But it's interesting to think back. When I think back to when I was a schoolboy, I had to walk in front of the bus home because the driver couldn't see the road, and somebody had to get out and just get them out of the smoggy bit till they get into clean air again. So things have changed a lot. My time in oncology had a number of consequences too in relation to food. First of all, in a sense, the consequences of lifestyle. People who smoked, for example, suddenly realized if they had lung cancer that there was a personal link there, which was quite important. It was also important in terms of the public concern about cancer and cancer related, and actually having to address the public on big issues like that, and how successful could you be. But also, as importantly, as we were talking about earlier with my colleague in the front seat there, the dietitian was pretty important in cancer care. And that, again, introduced me to the importance of diet. My time in public health, I think, has seen this rise in obesity and food-related illnesses, and it's certainly got worse. Its consequences, particularly of obesity, and you'll hear about this later, I'm sure, are now much more fully understood. There's a huge waste of food, and that related to food safety and to foodborne illness is really quite important. But the heart of all of this is communication, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment or two. Since I got the invitation to give this little talk, I've been checking the newspapers on a daily basis. It is astonishing just about how much there's written about food and its relation to illness or good health. Almost every day in the last 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a major story about food. It causes, I think, a bit of confusion. And there are too many messages. How would you make up your mind? I mean, in this room there are experts and they've got their mind made up, but how on earth would you make up your mind if you read the papers every day? The messages are different, some good, some bad. And one of the things that we found from the NMR campaign in terms of vaccination is that negative messages last longer than positive messages. So people are still thinking about the consequences of MMR vaccination in terms of its bad bit, and don't vaccinate children, whereas that's all gone now. And I think we've got to think about it in those terms. The most important quotation that I came across recently in a little shop near Anniesland Cross in Glasgow was, "The more you weigh, the more difficult it is to be kidnapped. Eat cake and stay slim and safe." So, I mean, it's quite interesting how that comes through. If you look at the data, of course, Lifespan is now down in some areas of England in particular. The inequalities gap has widened. And there's no doubt that something like obesity is now a major health problem, and how are we going to deal with it? Again, the negative messages are quite interesting. Cancer Research UK, with which I've had a long experience over the years, is their themes are obesity causes cancer, or obesity is the cause of cancer, have achieved great notoriety, an enormous amount of concern about that kind of message. Fat shaming is not on. But how do you get the balance right between the message that you give? Obesity causes cancer is not an untruth. That's what happens. Not to everybody, but it certainly happens. But if that means that fat people feel that they can't be talked to in that way, it switches them off. So the communication bit is really quite critical in that. The broader role of nutrition, I think, is achieving a great deal of public interest at the moment. In the BMJ on the 17th of March, there was a big article on food, and they're now over the next few weeks going to have a whole series of articles on food-related issues, particularly in terms of obesity, etc. And the point they made was a very interesting one, which I've almost alluded to already. In the olden days, things like vitamin D and vitamin C, when they were discovered and their advantages discovered, then nutrition had a very easy task. Take vitamin C or vitamin D and you'll get better. Now that things are complicated and complex, chronic diseases, it's much more difficult just to give a one pill and you'll be better. So nutrition now has to think much more in the complex series of things. The Food Standards Scotland, I think, website, I think is very good indeed, and the importance of the broader issues of food safety and illness are there. It's interesting, last night I spent half an hour looking through the Chief Medical Officer's annual reports when I was CMO in England. And this was triggered by my remembrance of Aberdeen, 1964, the typhoid epidemic. The reverberations of that continue, and it was actually such an important thing for everybody at the time. But when in 1992, if I looked at the Chief Medical's annual report, Officer's annual report, there was a little bit on nutrition and nothing really about infection. By 1997, there was a whole section on food, and the Food Standards Agency was set up. Within 7 years, that range had changed, and of course from that, Food Standards Scotland is part of that, and takes forward the big way of ensuring that food has its importance there. But I go back to basics for just a moment and say a little bit about determinants of health. And determinants of health include much more than just lifestyle. The issue, first of all, is the social and economic impact on what we eat and what we do. Jobs, education. For example, in 2015, the poorest children were 4.6 pounds heavier than the richest children. So just to make people change their lifestyle is not enough. The impact of social and environmental issues is important. The environment is very well related, particularly to things like food safety. Where you live and what your house looks like really can make a difference, and where you store your food and how you eat your food can make a difference. There are genetic things which are clearly relevant, and the health service itself, particularly in relation to social services, general practice and public health resources, that can change things. But one of the keys, of course, is lifestyle, and what we do and what we eat and what we don't eat. I came across in Alexander McCall Smith's book, Friends, Lovers and Chocolate, a little phrase which I hadn't seen before. It was acrasia. And acrasia is knowing that something's wrong but still doing it. And it's quite a nice term, and it's one which I use quite often. I have to think about it myself. And we do, most people know that eating too much and the wrong kind of food is not really very good for you. Same thing with cigarette smoking. People who smoke cigarettes cannot not know that it's bad for you, but you keep doing it. And the question is, how do you change that? So all of these have an impact to the economic, social, environment, and lifestyle. All have a relevance to what we eat. But what's the evidence like? And let me just give it some answers in relation to obesity itself. Obesity is increasing. The consequences of it are diabetes and some cancers, and the cancers are not easy ones to treat. Things like pancreatic and esophageal cancer, difficult ones sometimes. 6% of all cancer diagnoses are there, and if you compare that to 1974 when I was an oncologist, it's quite different. Obese parents make obese children, especially the mother. Poverty, and I've mentioned this already, 30% of women in deprived areas are overweight, whereas it's only 21% in richer areas, and there are significant differences across the UK. So there's a lot of evidence available. But the issues which come up are issues which you'll be discussing throughout the day. Advertising, fast food, multiple buy, promotions, cheap food, hidden calories, labelling of food, and eating out. I've recently been checking all the food that I eat for calories. It's quite difficult to find them sometimes and to rate them to the particular bit of food that you're going to eat. Food banks, another quite interesting issue. And of course, food safety and foodborne illnesses in the middle of that really do make a difference. The issue, I think, is if you're going to choose a diet, which one are you going to choose? And I'll not ask you to stand up and tell me, but you'll think about it. Interestingly, I lost a stone over a few months, just about a year ago. And in fact, I've kept that weight, and I've had to buy new clothes because I couldn't get into it. My others were too big. And I used a very special diet, which I'm not sure, Ross, whether I'm allowed to mention in this setting. Can I mention it? I didn't eat as much. I used a small plate. I didn't eat as much. And when I went out to dinner, these great dinners that I'm always invited to, I would usually have 2 starters and no main course. And I got a little bit of pudding probably, but not because I enjoy food, and we all enjoy food. But it's made a huge difference. And as I say, I've lost over a stone without actually suffering too much because I still enjoy my food. So eat small plates and don't eat too much food. One of the things that's been interesting, and it's relevant, I think, to the food standards in Scotland, is how much can the state intervene? You know, I can eat what I want, thank you very much. I don't want the FSA telling me what to eat. That's ridiculous. But is that true? And interestingly, in 2009, I wrote a little paper called Beyond the Nanny State. And it was a part of a Nuffield Council on Bioethics review of this, looking at the way in which the state can or cannot intervene. What right does the state have to intervene in what I eat and how I can buy things? And it was, I think, a very interesting one. Let me just mention 1 or 2 things from it. It means that public health programs should, 1, aim to reduce the risks of ill health that people might impose on each other. Secondly, to reduce the causes of ill health by regulations that ensure environmental conditions that sustain good health, clean air, clean water, safe foods, etc. Promote health not only by providing information, but also to prevent and assist people who deal with unhealthy behaviour and seek to ensure that they lead a healthy life. And it goes on like this, but it's quite an interesting one. We've done quite well in Scotland, I think, in relation to cigarette smoking, and alcohol is having the same kind of impact now in it. But what about food? Can FSS really tell me what to eat, and can they really restrict what I do? I think the answer is almost certainly yes to that. But it's a question which has to be dealt with in ethical terms, and where does the state fit? Part of it's about the greatest good for the greatest number, and the T.S. Mill's harm principle. If you're harming other people when you do certain things, then it's legitimate to stop that. Central to all of this, of course, is communication with the wider public. and the stories that are told and how they are told. One of my interests over the years has been something called the contagious theory of behaviour change. Behaviour changes because of stories that you hear. Behaviour changes because of lifestyle and role models. And you like your role models, and if they do things, you do them too. And if you want to read a good poem about role models, read Liz Lockhead's wonderful poem called Your Auntie. And her auntie is just wonderful. She wears the right shoes, the right bra. She drinks a wee bit, but she looks after her husband, and she's very good. What a role model that could be. And I think a lot of what we do in terms of our health relates to role models that we have, but also the stories that we hear. And if you look at the social media, how rapidly stories can move, how rapidly stories can change things. And you're going to be changing things today as you use the social media. But it does mean that we have to think hard about the stories. And I know there are a number of people in this audience with a particular interest in the public relations side of FSS and how that can change things. And stories are very important. We've used pretty hard-hitting campaigns related to cigarette smoking, but what ways could you use it in relation to food? How can you get the messages over and make them clear and not confused and not mixed up when they get into the press? A number of other things I think that we need to do is to educate professional staff in the NHS and social services. I don't think as a clinician I really had thought very much about food in terms of the individual patients that I saw, other than the cancer ones who were losing weight. And I think there are more that we could do in general practice, in social services, and in the NHS generally to make things better. So if I had some conclusions, they would be fairly straightforward. First of all, we enjoy food. I enjoy food. It's good for your health and well-being. It's a social activity. Eating with others is very pleasant to do, and it gives us friends and colleagues and allows us to share things with friends over a bite to eat. But eating too much spoils health, and there are major issues related to food safety and the kind of food that we eat. So if I had a final message, it would be eating well improves health and well-being. Enjoy food, enjoy life, eat well. Thank you very much.